roots of Orthodox spirituality.
Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy.
A wondrous journey into Orthodoxy.
Lord, have mercy.
Prepared and presented by Angeliki Antonakou, Lekea.
Lord have mercy, 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 Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy, 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 Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy.
Hello, dear listeners. We are continuing to read from the book Spiritual Awakening, the second volume in the series Spiritual Counsels by Saint Paisios. A spiritual state is a spiritual fortress. Today is the time for souls to be prepared, for if something were to happen, I don't know what lies ahead. May God prevent difficult days from coming, but if they do come, with a slight earthquake, a shake-up, whole brotherhoods, entire monasteries will come crashing down, because each one will try to save himself and go his own way. Much attention is needed for God not to abandon us. Your souls must have something spiritual in them. This is what makes you honorable. There will come a great shaking. I have told you so much. I have spoken so sternly. If I had been so forewarned, I would be troubled over it. I would ask why I was told such things and what must be done. For one thing, I wouldn't sleep over this for at least one night, if not for many nights. If I didn't see the difficult years ahead, I wouldn't be so troubled. But what I see is that later you will be greatly troubled. You may not understand me now, but you will understand me later. Yaronda, what is someone to do if he is alone during difficult years? Start now by first of all being obedient, acquiring discernment, and then we'll see. This is why we must first get rid of our faults. If one has faults, he will not be able to get through the difficult times. If now he complains about everything and considers himself to be a heroic person, while all the others are in a terrible spiritual state, imagine then. Make sure you correct yourselves now, so you will be entitled to divine help. Put your trust more into God and find your support in Him. We will have more difficult years. The fruits are still unripe. They haven't ripened yet. When you become spiritually mature, do you know what you will be? A fortress, not only for here, but you will be helpful to others further away. Otherwise, you too will need human help and protection. And have you any idea how bad it is for a monastery with so many sisters to be in need of laypersons? Today, as always, a monk must live spiritually in order to be able to overcome a difficulty. He must be prepared and not worry over deprivations, because then he may end up betraying Christ. A time will come when all the rivers will dry up. Everyone will be thirsty. Everyone will suffer. For us monks, this is not so terrible a thing. For if we are thirsty, we should be thirsty, having voluntarily accepted to endure hardships. And I will say, whatever I didn't do voluntarily as a monk, I now do involuntarily in order to understand what it means to be a monk. Thanks be to God. But what about the poor people? When people reach the point of inventing bombs which kill people and spare the buildings, what can I say? Christ said, "One soul is worth as much as the whole world." Matthew 16, verse 26. And yet they value buildings more than all the people. This is horrible. Yeronda, I am afraid of what awaits us. Such fear helps us to hold on to Christ. Not, of course, that one should rejoice over what awaits us, but at least one can rejoice at the chance to struggle for Christ. In other words, we may not go through an occupation like that of Hitler or Mussolini, but we will be tested for Christ. We won't win by having machine guns or atomic bombs. This will be a spiritual war. We will do battle with the devil himself. But the devil has no authority over us that we ourselves don't hand over to him. What then should we fear? It would be different if indeed the enemy were a Hitler or a Mussolini. But now let no fear be in you. In fact, rejoice that the battle is a spiritual one. If you live monastically, patristically, and are spiritually vigilant, you will be entitled to divine intervention in every attack of the enemy. If there are people of prayer, humble people, who have pain and love in their heart, they will serve as spiritual capital and be spiritual bases. When 2 or 3 souls exist in a monastery who think of the pain of others and who pray, this is a spiritual fortress that can keep all enemies at bay.
Remember us all in His kingdom always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages.
Prayer, proper living example. Yeroda, what is the proper position for a monk to take in today's difficult circumstances? First of all, there must be prayer, proper living, setting a good example, and whenever and wherever needed, speaking out. Do you mean that a monk must speak out when the situation requires it? But of course, if a monk doesn't speak out, who will? A monk has nothing to fear. The others are afraid of being removed from their positions. Those of us who are dedicated to God must lead the way, otherwise who will? My thought tells me that God will not allow it. He will not allow it. This present situation will be cleared up, for now it seems there is a large net which contains fish but which is rotten. It goes this way and that way, but in the end it will break. And it won't break because the fish are large, but because the net is rotten. Yeroda, are the fish the Christians? Yes, and the others are the eels, the snakes. But we too will be accountable to God for this situation. I am now speaking openly. I cannot contain myself any more. Yeroda, what then are we supposed to do? First of all, we must work on ourselves. For as a monk, my goal is to dissolve my own human spirit, to correct myself first, to become a truly spiritual person. For otherwise, my life as a monk has no meaning. Then we must speak out when needed, and God will help to bring about positive results. Yeroda, some people say it is better to keep silent and pray. You can't be indifferent when everything is burning around you. You must put out the fire. The pain won't let you keep silent. Of course, the most important thing is to try to live a spiritual life as far as possible. And if it becomes necessary to take a certain position on an important issue, a monk will take the position which God permits. Live humbly, simply, and spiritually, so that at a difficult moment you will not be obliged to make compromises. Next, make sure that young women will come to become nuns who have the necessary prerequisites for monasticism, so they can become true and authentic nuns. When someone becomes a true monk, then he knows how far he should concern himself with a particular issue. He will know what to do and what not to do, and how he should act. If he doesn't become a true monk, then everything goes wrong. Do you understand this? If you become true nuns, you will act with prudence. But if you don't become true nuns, and you send one of your number out into the world, you must instruct her in detail to say this up to this point, say that up to that point, for otherwise she may say foolish things. This, of course, is a condition of one who is underdeveloped. How then can one get through difficult situations? For this reason, those who have the necessary prerequisites for monasticism should be cultivated and developed to become true nuns, so they know how far to go and what to say and not to say. So they know what to do in a difficult situation, and they will function within the boundaries of obedience, for their spirit will agree with the spirit of the abbess. At a critical moment, the abbess will make one simple gesture, and the nuns will understand, because they are working on the same wavelength. Otherwise, you cannot have a spiritual community. If you don't learn to work this way, someone else may break into the same frequency, saying different things and doing great harm without you realizing it. Monasticism is in danger. The world today is burning, and monasticism is weakening, unraveling, losing its value. If the spirituality of monasticism goes, nothing remains. On the holy mountain, a pilgrim said to a monk, "Is there no spirit of asceticism here?" The monk replied, "This is now a new period in our history. Those things are gone." You may say that this was just one fool. There may be another 5 or 10 such fools, but if they say such silly things, they should be locked up in the monastery tower. They have no right to say such things, denigrating monasticism in our time and scandalizing people. Some people are just looking for such an occasion for scandal. In time, you will see some monasteries gradually doing away with the patristic readings so that they will not be censured by them. They will introduce other readings of a social nature because supposedly they are helpful in our times. That is where we are going. And the poor laypersons come to the monasteries to be helped. Just as the devout person in society is now scorned, soon the true monk will be scorned in the monasteries. If we are not vigilant to prevent the influence of the secular spirit from taking over, God forbid, before long a young man will come to the monastery wishing to live a true monastic life, and the others will say, "What business have you here with us?" When the people see monks who are no different from lay people in the world, they become disillusioned with monasticism in general. Many come and tell me how they are scandalized by certain monasteries. How am I now to correct such thoughts? Much of the secular spirit has entered into monasticism, and there is no end to it. Monks must be monks, not worldly people. We have lost the simplicity which the older generations had. Now the young monks are guided by human reasoning and a worldly politeness. They are too careful not to lose their good name and so forth. A few years ago, one could still see in the Cenobitic monasteries the true Lapsaikon tradition of monasticism. The Laziac history contains the biographies of ascetic saints of Egypt and Palestine. The work was written approximately the middle of the 5th century by Bishop Paisios of Helenopolis in Bithynia, and was dedicated to the Byzantine patrician Lassos, from whom it takes its name. Some entered monasteries out of a zeal, and others out of repentance. There were many different circumstances. Someone whose wife had died would leave the world and enter a monastery. Another who had lived a worldly life for years would repent and enter a monastery. You could find even possessed people in the monastery who took refuge there and were healed by the prayers of the fathers, and then stayed on to become monks. If afterward they fell into some disorder, they became possessed again. And so there were some who were possessed in the monasteries. You could also find some who were in error, others who were fools for Christ, and monks who had the gift of foresight, and others with the gift of healing. There was a great variety. Today you find neither the gift of foresight nor the gift of healing, not even any fools for Christ or any possessed. We now have the other foolishness, the foolishness of the world. We have become cerebral, and this makes us fools. Much worldly reasoning has entered into our life, and this abundance of reasoning is destroying everything. And to make things worse, we don't even realize it's a problem. Today monasteries are filled with all sorts of modern conveniences, which make the monk's life inconvenient. They fuss unnecessarily over details, but can't find time for spiritual things that should be their first concern. If young people entering the monasteries merely exchange worldly anxiety for officiousness in the monastery, they won't find peace. Soon they will want to become spiritual tourists, to take trips, to have a break. I want to take my holiday, they will tell you, whereas a monk should tear himself away from his monastic cell with difficulty. I am exasperated by a lot of things, and this is why I'm speaking out. I am pained by the present situation, because in the past the poor monks didn't even have spiritual books and were ignorant of monasticism, and yet were able to progress. 30% of them were born to be monks. The others who entered the monasteries were uncultivated, and as the saying goes, they were walnuts from 500 different walnut trees, and yet were able to progress. Someone would go to the monastery knowing nothing about spiritual things. He could stay there for 2 or 3 months, and not even the abbot would know who he was. After that, when he said that he wanted to become a monk, he went to the spiritual father, made his confession, and stayed in the monastery. And no one knew what kind of person he was, where he had come from, and so forth. And the newcomer, despite all the problems and shortcomings he may have had, progressed in the spiritual life. And some of them were not even literate. They listened to the readings in the refectory, in the lives of the saints in church, and nothing else. And sometimes they didn't even understand the readings in the refectory. Neither did they understand much of the chanting. They merely said a few prayers during the church services, but they had good thoughts. And yet they reached spiritual heights, whereas now with Sunday schools, with spiritual books, with so many advantages, everything goes to waste. In other words, the uncultivated people have cultivated a remarkable spiritual life, while the cultivated ones have nothing. In a way, it's like having a cultivated field that doesn't even produce enough to pay for the seed sown. Isn't this a serious problem? How do you see it? In any case, if we aren't careful, monasticism will not be able to stand. It will be blown away. Of course, the future belongs to Christ, and the matter is in the hands of our loving Mother, Panagia, who will take up the broom and again sweep out and tidy up her monasteries. We must understand that everything will be lost and that we will stand in debt before God if we do not live a true and authentic monastic life. We started out to become monks, to work for the salvation of our souls and to help the people in the world through prayer. For this reason, do not forget the promise you made to Christ, as you must not forget what people have to endure in the world who were not favored to be called into the angelic order of monasticism. Let us leave an inheritance. Yeronda, many people place their hopes on the monasteries. I feel the heavy burden of this responsibility. Yes, the only thing left now, as many say, is for some saints, like Saint Cosmas the Etolos, to go around the country preaching and enlightening the people. The monasteries are spiritual centers. If the monasteries were not there to help with the Greek Revolution of 1821, how could the revolution have taken place? Again, during the German occupation of World War II, it was the monasteries which held things together for the poor people. This is why they were destroyed later by the bands of communist sympathizers during the guerrilla warfare. Most monasteries were not burned by the Germans. They were destroyed by these bands of communist sympathizers. The Germans had threatened, if we find weapons in the monasteries, we will burn them. To make themselves look good and to give the impression that it was the Germans who burned the monasteries, these bands conspired by leaving some old weapons in the monasteries and then reporting it to the Germans. When the Germans found these old weapons in the monasteries, they set the monasteries on fire. With this sinister technique, the communist bands had many monasteries burned because they were afraid of them. This was their reasoning. Even if the state becomes atheistic, we will not be able to achieve our goal if the monasteries remain. So let's burn them. And they burned them in this way. Today people will go to the monasteries to find some spiritual yeast. But if the monasteries have become lukewarm and have no good spiritual yeast to give, what will people take? They won't find any yeast. We must therefore try to keep some yeast for the difficult years ahead. People who used to go to magicians and sorcerers now come to the monasteries for help. Later, people who are tired and weary of sin will come to us. And then, even if we send them out to drink and to sin, they won't go. During these difficult years, God is calling people with a personal invitation to join the ranks of monasticism. This generation starts out for monasticism on the best of terms, with ideals, but the devil renders useless all this potential. The next generation won't be like this. Many will come to the monasteries who will not be suitable for the monastic life. They will be in such a state that they will be forced to become monks. They will be worn out and wounded by the world. Married couples will be divorced, with or without the blessing of the Church, and these spouses will go their separate ways to live in the monasteries. Young people who are weary of the worldly life will go to the monastery, some for the salvation of their soul, and others to find some peace and serenity. Others who really want to marry, but who are afraid to commit themselves to another person, will become monks. In other words, in the coming years, people with mental illness and others who hesitate to start a family will perhaps come to the monasteries. They will be saying to themselves, "What will I find in married life? What will I do in the world? It's better to go and become a monk." That is to say, some people will take monasticism to be a life of ease and idleness. Now, as to what kind of spiritual progress they may make, well, that's another matter. No one will come in a spirit of repentance. People will be in such a state that they'll be forced to become monks. Their motives won't be pure. This is the danger. It's different if someone sets out specifically to become a monk. These people will need a great deal of help because, having tasted the pleasures of the world, the devil will oppose them more strenuously, while the rest of us will not be opposed so vigorously. With us, the devil will try to prevent our spiritual work, to weaken our resolve with negligence or slothfulness, so that those who follow us will not find any spiritual yeast to ferment their own spiritual life. What I'm trying to say with all this is that we must now make spiritual progress in order to be able to help these other people. We must leave them a patristic inheritance. We have spiritual joys, but we don't have heavenly joys. We have an ordination, a vigil, we chant the psalm, servants of the Lord, and we even swing the chandeliers and experience joy. But these are not heavenly joys. They are physical joys of the heart, in the good sense of the term. Heavenly joy is something higher, which cannot be expressed in words. When one begins to taste a little of these heavenly realities, the heart is profoundly stirred and seized by a divine madness. We must experience these joys of heaven so we can transmit them to the coming generations. Dear listeners, our show has come to an end. Thank you for listening. We will continue once again where we left off in our next show. Until then, be well.
And unto ages of ages. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have
Readings of Orthodox Spirituality.
Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy.
A wondrous journey into Orthodoxy.
Lord, have mercy.
Prepared and presented by Angeliki Antonakou Lekea.